14,000 years ago. Global sea levels were exactly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. Close your eyes and imagine this. The coastlines we know by heart on today's maps simply did not exist back then. The most fertile, warmest, and best irrigated plains in the world were exposed to the sun. Millions of square miles of prime living space are now permanently buried under thousands of tons of seawater. The Persian Gulf is one of these regions. Today, with an average depth of just about 36 meters, it is one of the shallowest seas on Earth. But rewind those thousand years, and there was absolutely no seawater here. Beneath those rolling waves lay a massive valley, firmly shielded by majestic mountain ranges on three sides and nourished by a spectacular hydrological network. Four great rivers converged here, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and two ancient riverbeds, Wadi al-Batin and Wadi al-Saba, scars that humanity can only dimly see today through synthetic aperture radar scans from NASA satellites. Four rivers flowing into a single valley. Remember this detail because for thousands of years, the oldest religious texts have described the Garden of Eden as a central garden where four massive rivers intersect. For over 2 millennia, humanity and scholars dismissed this as mere theological metaphor, a parable, a poetic description of a spiritual state rather than a real geographical coordinate. But modern bathymetric data tells a completely different story. That coordinate exists. It has been mapped in detail. It lies right at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and along those ancient coastlines, now submerged deep beneath the ocean, hide the physical remnants of a super civilization. A civilization so brilliant, possessing metallurgy and precision, crafting technology so ruthless that it far surpasses and predates anything modern history dares to define as the starting point of humanity. The mainstream education system and orthodox history textbooks always spoon-feed us a single chorus, a safe, impassable boundary. Mesopotamia, specifically the ancient Sumerian city-states, around 5,000, tell us this is the cradle of human civilization, that this is where primitive humans first learned to plow, invented cuneiform writing, built mud brick structures, and established the first legal codes. Everything before that timeline is brushed aside, relegated to the dark Stone Age, where humans supposedly only knew how to hunt and gather in caves. And this is exactly where this arrogant explanation completely collapses. Winter of 2001, Kerman Province, Southeastern Islamic Republic of Iran. Unusually torrential rains caused a historic flood on the Halil Road, a small, gentle river flowing through an arid plain from the Zagros Mountains. The raging waters ripped tons of soil and rock from the hills scattered along its banks. Hills that local farmers had plowed and sown for centuries, without ever knowing what lay right beneath their plowshares. When the waters receded, they washed away topsoil, exposed thousands of artifacts, not crude, shattered pottery fragments, but jars, bowls, vases, cups, and stone tablets carved from chlorite. a deep green mineral, softer than granite but hard enough to defy the ravages of millennia. The precision of the relief carved on this chlorite stone would make any modern sculpting engineer shiver. Snakes with individually carved scales, eagles with rows of feathers sharp to the millimeter, geometric patterns repeating flawlessly as if programmed by an algorithm. We are talking about the Jiroft culture. When Professor Youssef Majidzadeh, one of Iran's most respected archaeologists, conducted stratigraphic core drilling and used radiocarbon dating, the results shook the foundations of Near Eastern chronology. The timeline of the oldest sedimentary layers at Jiroft dates back to 4800 BCC, centuries older than the earliest Sumerian city-states, older than Uruk, older than Eridu. And the most terrifying part? There is absolutely no trace of a transitional phase. No crude early attempts, no evolutionary curve from low to high. The artifacts at Jiroft appear in the very first stratum in a state of absolute perfection, as if a population brought a fully intact, highly advanced technological and artistic foundation from somewhere else and dropped it right onto this land. To understand the absurdity of this phenomenon, we cannot just look through the lens of a traditional archaeologist. Let's look at metallurgy, the backbone of any technological era. Mainstream science tells us the Sumerians were the masters of metallurgy. Sumerian bronze was tin bronze, the standard formula, 90% copper and 10% tin. But mass spectrometry analysis of the ruins in Jiroft and the Iranian plateau reveals a shocking truth. The metallurgists here did not use tin. They used arsenical bronze, mixing 2 to 4% arsenic with pure copper. This is not a cheap or primitive alternative. It is an entirely different technological branch. Arsenical bronze has a higher melting point, yields a brighter silver color, and offers superior corrosion resistance in humid environments. But the price is life itself. Arsenic fumes generated during the melting process are highly toxic. To mass produce this alloy, Jiroft's metallurgical engineers had to master the principles of thermodynamics and dynamics, design furnace with flawless pressure control and ventilation systems. Otherwise, the entire workforce would die from gas poisoning. This technique requires an ancient school of chemistry, a rigorous quality control process. It was not inherited from Sumer. It was developed in parallel, or brought from another mysterious civilization. Now, let's broaden our view to a macro scale. Look at the geological data. Em 2010, Dr. Jeffrey Rose, an archaeologist at the University of Birmingham, published a groundbreaking study in the rigorously peer-reviewed journal Current Anthropology, analyzing sedimentary drill cores from the bottom of the Persian Gulf. His team found the biological signatures of terrestrial plants, pollen, and freshwater deposits. The conclusion: throughout the last ice age, the Persian Gulf was a vast oasis, supplied with water from the Zagros Mountains. But as sea levels rose at the end of the ice age, water from the Indian Ocean breached the Strait of Hormuz. The salt water devoured this oasis. Millions of people living in that fertile valley were forced to flee. Where did they go? Archaeological data along the shores of the Persian Gulf in Nefi, Kuwait, Bahrain, and coastal Iran shows a population explosion and the sudden appearance of settlements around 8000 BC. They arrived at the shores bringing metallurgical technology, irrigation agriculture systems, and masterful stone crafting techniques. They were not the inventors of civilization. They were refugees carrying the remnants of a sunken empire. And here is the final piece of the puzzles, coming from ancient texts themselves. Berossus, a Babylonian scholar and priest, serving at the Temple of Bel in the 3rd century BC, translated the history of Mesopotamia from the oldest ancient texts. He wrote clearly about Oannes, or Uana in Sumerian, the first deity of the 7 Apkallu-Sages. Berossus described an entity rising from the Erythraean Sea, today's Persian Gulf. This entity had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was a human head, and beneath the fish's tail were human feet. It stepped ashore and taught the native coastal inhabitants, who were living savagely like wild beasts, mathematics, architecture, the geometry, the distinction of seeds, and the foundations of law. When the sun set, it returned and slept at the bottom of the ocean. Conservative academics always laugh off and label these records as the absurd myths of primitive people. But let's look at it through the lens of logic. If a historian living in an era without cameras had to this modern maritime terminology had to describe an oral history about a group of people fleeing a land submerged, deep thermal diving suits, stepping ashore in thermal diving suits, or simply emerging from the water, carrying boundless knowledge, Ashi, what would they call it? Mythology is essentially oral history. It's just that the vocabulary of that time was incapable of accurately reflecting the technology used. Oannes was not a fishman monster. It is the collective memory of humanity about the survivors from the buffer zone at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Of course, Western academia cannot accept this reversal of black and white. Their reaction? Polite silence or desperate attempts to force these anomalous facts into the narrow molds of old theories. They call Jiroft merely an accidental trading post that eavesdropped on Sumerian techniques. They use words like coincidence or universal religious beliefs to explain away every paradox. But how do they explain the existence of the handbag of the gods? Across the Jiroft sites, the image of a figure holding a rectangular bag with a semicircular handle is deeply carved. Where is the coincidence when the exact same handbag symbol, with the exact same grip posture and geometric proportions, appears in the hands of the Apkallu on Sumerian reliefs, on the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, Turkey 7,000 kilometers away, and even on the statues of the Olmec civilization in Mexico, on the other side of the globe, separated by thousands of years, with no trade route that could transport an abstract idea across the Atlantic Ocean. Academia calls it convergent evolution. Simifo, a beautiful scientific phrase used to cover up their impotence in explaining a globally shattered network of knowledge. And if the handbag is still dismissed as a project of imaginary science, how will mainstream science explain melting rocks, Sitting right at the entrance of the Persian Gulf is Qeshm Island in the Strait of Hormuz. Along the southern coast of this island lies the Valley of Stars. Here, geologists are confronted with limestone and sandstone blocks exhibiting vitrified surfaces. The rock's surface is smooth and glossy, as if someone used a giant plasma torch to melt it and let it solidify. To melt limestone, you need temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Celsius. For sandstone to vitrify, it takes over 1300 degrees. Natural wildfires never exceed 800 degrees. Even the most advanced blast furnaces of the Bronze Age rarely surpassed 1200 degrees. The nearest active volcano is over 1,000 kilometers north. Lightning strikes only create fulgurites, small finger-sized tubes through the sand. Never a vitrified surface spanning hundreds of square meters. Dr. Farrokh Cods and his team described it in their report as thermally altered surfaces. A, a brilliant packaging of words, naming the phenomenon without daring to provide a cause. An explosion, a high-energy weapon, an impact. The only thing we know for sure is this terrifying heat-generating event occurred exactly at the gateway to the delta that sank to the ocean floor. Now, throw away all prejudices and put all these logical facts side by side. We have bathymetric data confirming the Persian Gulf was once a fertile valley with 4 interlocking rivers, a coordinate matching the biblical Garden of Eden perfectly. We have the sudden appearance of numerous settlements along the rising coastlines, with no trace of gradual evolution. We have the Jiroft culture older than Sumer, possessing deadly arsenical metallurgy they could not have learned from Mesopotamia. We have the handbag of knowledge, symbol linking 3 entirely isolated continents. We have detailed Sumerian records of beings emerging from the deep sea to teach civilization. And finally, we have a valley full of vitrified rocks subjected to 1,300 degrees Celsius right at the entrance to that very sea, with no volcano to explain it. 6 macro data points, too insane to be called a coincidence, too precise to be brushed aside as a system error in measuring equipment. It is a pattern, ironclad proof that the chronology we memorize every day is a deeply flawed product. We are always taught that human evolution is a straight line going from dark caves, striking rocks for fire, and gradually building today's skyscraper. But the stones at Jiroft, at the stones in Century City, at the bottom of the Persian self-scouse, I segment the arsenical metallurgy, are screaming is a different truth, screaming a different truth. The picture of human history is far more complex, ruthless, and monumental. The rise and fall of civilizations do not follow a straight line, but repeat in massive cycles. Sumer was not the beginning. Cuneiform was not humanity's first brushstroke. Mesopotamia was actually the end. It was the final stop, the tattered remnants of a mighty superempire swallowed by a global catastrophe. The builders of the Mesopotamian civilization were not pioneers creating from scratch. They were survivors clinging to the flickering light of a brilliant technology swallowed by darkness and the ocean. What we call the dawn of civilization was, in fact, a desperate attempt to rebuild a collapsed world order. 21st century humanity considers itself the sole pinnacle of development. We arrogantly look at the past through the lens of the victors. But the evidence buried at the bottom of the Persian Gulf poses a painful question. If we are not the first peak, then what wiped out those who came before us? Is history repeating its ruthless cycle? And will our boastful civilization leave behind anything more than microplastics and inorganic ash when the next great deluge strikes? What do you think about the mysteries at the bottom of the Persian Gulf? How many more oceans are hiding the true origins of humanity? Leave your thoughts and arguments in the comments section. And if you think the collapse of the timeline at the Persian Gulf is the peak of the shock, you are not ready for what comes next. As we move thousands of miles to the west, crossing the Sahara Desert, an industrial logistics system made of basalt rock shatters every law of towing, power, and energy. In the next video, the untold truth about the construction technology of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Hit subscribe and don't miss it.